Hello, ladies and gents. This is Mr. Windsor speaking. Welcome back to another edition of Year 7 History with Mr. Windsor. Last lesson we spoke about the end of the Civil War, Cromwell versus King Charles I, Parliament versus the monarchy. Charles is in charge of the Loyalist Cavaliers, and Parliament is in charge of something called the New Model Army, paid for by Parliament, also known as the Roundheads. Eventually, Cromwell wins out in the Civil War, and Charles I is executed in January. He supposedly wears two shirts so that it doesn't seem like, because it's a cold day, and he doesn't want it to seem as if he's scared. So, last lesson we spoke about King Charles II. Eventually, Cromwell dies. His son is put up to the job of Lord Protector. You cynical students amongst you might say, well, Cromwell, sir, was just a king, just with an entirely different name. And you are kind of, in essence, right. They did offer Cromwell a kingship. He refused, but he had a large amount of power, even if he didn't take the kingship. So let's think about last lesson. Think about King Charles II and the Restoration. Do a little mind map on a spare piece of paper or on a spare piece inside your resource booklet and see what you can remember from last lesson. Okay, so let's review last lesson's work. So as I said, Robert Cromwell is the next in line to be Lord Protector, but he is not up to the job. He's not the same as his dad, and eventually he kind of renounces the idea of being Lord Protector, and Parliament instead looks for a king again. King Charles II is well known to be alive and well, and so they ask him to be restored to the throne. When King Charles II is restored to the throne, he exhumes Cromwell's body. He takes it out of the ground and he hangs it like a common criminal, clearly very, very bitter about what Cromwell did to his father. He also gives a declaration called the Declaration of Breda, where he gives a number of promises of what he will do now. He promises, one of those promises is to keep Parliament. There's a long history of kings saying that they'll listen to Parliament and going off to do their own thing, and basically having all of the power, something called absolute monarchy. So King Charles is going to have something called limited monarchy, where he has only most of the power rather than all of it. He also says that people will have religious freedom. Also, up until this point, there has been a bit of a religious roller coaster of Protestantism and Catholicism. The previous king will be a Catholic, the one before that will be Protestant. And basically, this gets rid of any conflict between the two different types of Christianity by offering religious freedom to all. King Charles II also restores entertainment like the theatre. Cromwell was what's known as a Puritan, so he was a very, very strict Christian, and he believed that people should concern themselves only with worshipping God in a very sort of down key, humble manner, and therefore anything that's too fun should be banished because it distracts people from worshipping God. So he banished theatre and a bunch of other fun things, which King Charles now brings back. People are going to be very, very pleased because without things like streaming services, internet, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, people have very few ways to entertain themselves, and theatre is one of them. Another thing, he legalizes drinking in taverns. It's not just the actual act of getting drunk, it's more also the act of socializing as well, which people were not allowed to do under Cromwell, which they're very, very happy about. He also makes it legal to gamble again. Gambling is considered a bit taboo by Christianity, and so Cromwell had outlawed it. Also, people are getting themselves into debt, which people are now legally allowed to do again. Also, King Charles II brings back sport. It is said that King Charles is very, very keen on tennis. So basically, the people rejoice under the rule of King Charles. Cromwell kept a very firm lid on things because he was very Puritan, very Protestant. No one can have too much fun. And all of those things that Cromwell banned have now been brought back under Charles II. So not only has the monarchy been restored under the Restoration, but also fun and joy and happiness and laughter have as well. Okay, so that leads me on to today's session. So we're going to be talking about Christopher Columbus, or let's use his actual name because he was Italian, Cristoforo Colombo, and the discovery of the New World. We're going to use some contextual information, some information from your booklets, and some information that I have gathered from various different corners of the internet. Why we're going to do that, we're going to show how European influence gradually began to creep around the world in this new age of exploration, in particular in this lesson, the Americas. So what we're seeing in this is a Renaissance painting, so made around 1400, 1500, 1600, that kind of area. What we're seeing is a bit of a scene of chaos aboard one of Columbus's boats, one of his ships rather. We see some three over in the background looking very surprised or fearful of something in this direction. Someone here praying, a man here ready to fight, someone over here, perhaps they're very sick or just very, very upset, and some man clutching at Columbus's robes there. This guy looking towards God, opening his shirt, saying, "Oh God, what's going to happen? Maybe I should get in a quick prayer before my death." In this chaotic scene, we can see that Columbus himself standing taller above any of the other people on the boat, holding a map and staring into the distance, is a picture of calm collectedness. He is cool, he is purposeful, and he's painted here as being quite heroic. However, in this lesson, we're going to see if he was that heroic. There are two sides to every coin. It's not useful to do the whole was he good or was he bad argument, because of course there are many shades of grey in between those two extremes. So let's get a bit of cultural background. I always think that good history starts with geography. So we're around the 1490s, 1500s. We are here, by the way, on this little bulge, for better or worse. Hello, Hastings. So our story starts here in Italy. We know this is Italy because it's a little boot and it pokes out into the Mediterranean Sea. This is where Cristoforo Colombo is born. So he's quite a good explorer in his young years. He's quite energetic. He does a lot of exploring, and he has a plan. All the other countries, very recently, there's been a path discovered to get to Asia. Asia is a bit mysterious to people in Europe at this point. They know that people who go to Asia often come back with many, many rich resources, gold, silk, spices, all that sort of thing. And so everyone wants to go there and make their fortune. So most recently, a route to Asia has been discovered. If you go this way, out, left past Spain, down the coast of Africa, round the tip of the Cape of Good Hope, very ironically named, also named the Cape of Storms. You either go close to the coast here, through, and over here to Asia. So that has been discovered quite recently, and monarchs from all over Europe are sponsoring people to go on expeditions to bring back these riches from China. It's worth noting at this point, around 70 years before our story starts, Portuguese boats are going up and down this coastline here, stealing resources like gold, spices, and abducting people as well. This is kind of the beginning of the fledgling slave trade. Around this time, people in the very wealthy and very cultured kingdoms of West Africa begin actually selling off their inhabitants because they realize money can be made for it. So these people are being sold off with the consent of the people who rule over them. So Portuguese mostly, and then other people from around Europe get on in it. People in Scandinavia, for example, the Swedes, get in on this trade as well. So Christopher Columbus has done a few calculations. He reckons the world is a lot smaller than people actually think. And so rather than going on this very, very long, arduous journey around the southern tip of Africa and over this way, he reckons he can get there in less time by just going straight west through here and over to Asia. Let's see how that goes for him. So a lot of people turn down his plan to go straight west to find Asia until he approaches King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Aragon in Spain. They are impressed with his plan and they decide to fund him. They give him money to build ships and to pay sailors to make this journey straight west to get to what they think is going to be Asia, but what actually turns out to be the Americas. Okay, so we've got some geographic context. Let's find out a few more things about Christopher Columbus. He's Italian by birth, real name Cristoforo Colombo. He's interested in finding wealth and fortune, much like the kings and queens of the day. They want to seek their fortune in Asia. By 1420, Portuguese boats sailed up and down the African coast, acquiring exotic spices, gold, and slaves to take back to Europe. You could argue this is the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, or to take with them on their voyage to sell in Asia. So some people, since they're going to Asia anyway, they think, hey, let's make a few more bucks. Let's grab some, forcibly abduct some people from Africa and sell them in Asia. So you could say that actually the slave trade begins in the 1400s by people trying to make an extra bit of cash by selling live people as slaves who will be slaves the rest of their lives. Pretty shocking, really. During the 15th and 16th centuries, wealthy monarchs, kings and queens, sponsored explorers to go on expeditions to find materials that could be brought back to their country and sold. This would often be at the cost of people who lived where the resources were, often receiving nothing in exchange for their resources and treated poorly or exterminated by white settlers. So yeah, basically white settlers a lot of the time will go to these places, find places that are rich in gold. They will take those resources, give nothing back to the native people, and often it will end in things like genocide. For instance, when Australia was colonized by Captain Cook in a very short space of time, about 80% of the indigenous Aborigine people had been exterminated by white settlers. And this is a pattern that repeats itself all over the world in this era while new lands are being discovered. Other European countries, particularly Spain, wanted a share in the limitless riches of the Far East, after successfully throwing minorities such as Jewish people and Muslims from their kingdoms. So these countries were not inclusive. They did not have a healthy attitude to anyone that was from outside of their own country, or especially people who did not share their skin tone. So Spain is a good example of this after expelling all Jewish and Muslim people from their kingdoms. Cristoforo Colombo was certain he would be able to reach Asia by going west and finding a passage that way rather than going around the coast of Africa. After a few unsuccessful attempts to convince wealthy politicians of his plan, he was finally able to convince King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella of Castile to support his plan. These guys are also the parents of Catherine of Aragon, one of Henry VIII's future wives. So this is what a map looks like back then. Obviously, these people did not have satellite technology. They were also not able to get up into the air because planes had not been invented yet, or any kind of flying machine. And so the alternative was to go by foot or go by boat around the coastlines of these countries and chart it by hand. And the result of that is a fairly decent, quite primitive map that we're seeing in front of us now. So we're over here inside this red circle, a fairly insignificant blob on this map. And we can see perhaps some of the inaccuracies of some of these countries. They tend to get more inaccurate the further you go east because these places were less explored. You can already see that Britain, France, Spain, Italy, and Greece all fairly well formed and a decent shape that we know it to be today. So new discoveries. The world was getting smaller because many places had yet to be discovered. Many places were being explored, and so the world seemed quite a lot smaller. Christopher Columbus, born in 1451, was one of the world's most famous explorers. He sailed across the Atlantic Ocean in 1492 from Europe to the new land of America. Christopher Columbus learned to sail in a wooden ship with sails. He learned to find his way at sea by using the stars, the sun, and a compass. So the way you'd navigate by then is, yes, you'd use a map, but you also follow a star chart, and if you followed a particular star, it would lead you in a certain direction. He wanted to explore the world, and with money given to him by the King and Queen of Spain, he was able to. Columbus and his sailors had no idea what they would find when they set out. After many weeks at sea, they ran food and water. Finally, on the 36th day, they saw land. It was the Bahamas. Before Columbus had been to the Americas, no one in Europe had ever tried a tomato or potato. These are things that he ended up bringing back to Europe. When he landed, Columbus met some indigenous people, native people, who lived on the land. Columbus called them Indians because he thought he had landed in the Indies or in India. However, today they're known as the Native American people, and the islands, we still call them the West Indies. One of Columbus's ships was damaged on Christmas Day in 1492. He took the other ships home with some of the indigenous people on it. This can't be understated. With some of the indigenous people on it, what this actually means is that they were taken back as slaves. They were going to serve as slaves the rest of their lives, or they were taken back to be some curious sort of sideshow because these people looked different from white Europeans. So perhaps they were just taken back for entertainment so that other people could have a good old laugh at the indigenous people. Pretty shocking, pretty disgusting stuff. He had to leave 40 men behind. When he went back to collect them, they were all dead. So this is an excerpt from Cristoforo Colombo's personal diary when he landed in these islands. This is what he said about the native people, and see if you can detect the tone of what he's saying here. The inhabitants don't have any form of iron. They cannot make weapons, which they are unadapted for anyway. They are well made and full of terror. Once they see that they are safe, they are very honest and pure. They give you anything you ask for, and offer you things you don't ask for either. They show a lot of affection to all of us, exchanging valuable things for things of no value. I gave them many beautiful and pleasing things which I had brought with me in order to win their affection, and that they might become Christians and inclined to love our king and queen and princes and all the people of Spain, and that they might be eager to search for and gather and give to us what they have and what we greatly need. So a few things strike me as all wrong here. The fact that he takes glee in the fact they don't have weapons, so they can't defend themselves properly. They're unadapted for. So reading between the lines, it sounds like he's saying these people are barbaric, are unsophisticated, are in some way primitive. He's very gleeful in the fact that they just give their stuff away, which is going to make them really, really easy to exploit when it comes to taking away their resources like gold and spices and herbs and food and anything that they need. Uh, he also says so that they might become Christians. So, because white people hadn't been there before, they hadn't been able to spread Christianity. Anyone who was a Christian regarded those who weren't Christian as primitive, as the enemy, and as people who are not worth dealing with. And so, the idea of them not being Christians meant that he perhaps thought that these native people deserved what was coming to them. Okay, so what's the task then? It's going to take you a bit of time. Imagine that you're part of Columbus's crew on the voyage where he discovered the new lands of America. How did you find these lands? Who gave you the money? How long did it take you? What food did you discover? What people did you find there? What happened on Christmas Day 1492? So you can rewind and use these slides to help you. Some background information on Christopher Columbus, some information on what he himself thinks of the natives as well, in order to help you write this letter. It's going to take you about 10 minutes. Have a crack at that. Okay, so some more information. So for this task, you could have written things like, they were funded by the King and Queen of Aragon, Ferdinand and Isabella. It took them 36 days, just over a month to get there. They discovered new foods like tomatoes and potatoes. The people Christopher Columbus perhaps thought were very primitive. They were a bit easy to get stuff off. They were easy to manipulate and to exploit. And they were barbaric, unsophisticated, non-Christians. So that's perhaps what they would have thought of these people, of the indigenous people. So with improved ships in the 1400s, Europeans began to discover and colonize many places around the world. I love how discover is in inverted commas here. Discover broadly means, when you find a place and then treat the native population very badly, often ending in thousands of deaths. 1488, Diaz sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, creating a new route to India. So about, 6 years before Columbus goes to the New World. So 4 years. Columbus discovers the Caribbean and with it the New World. 1519 and 1533, two hugely sophisticated and complex cultures, the Aztec and Inca empires, are destroyed by Spanish settlers. First, Aztec is by Hernan Cortez, and the Inca by Pizarro. Again, these they give us a bit of a case study on how white European settlers deal with native peoples. Two very, very interesting and highly sophisticated cultures brought down by the need for resource, basically. 1770s, Australia and New Zealand discovered by Captain James Cook. A few years, about 80% of the native population of Australia were dead. Okay, so you've got two sources here. One of them is a German artist's interpretation of the natives of Guyana, and the other one is by a chap called Theodore de Bry for his work America Part 4, titled Because the Spanish Thirst for Gold, the Indians Pour Liquid into Them. And what we're seeing is the indigenous people melting down gold and pouring it down the throat of a Spanish explorer. This is a curious depiction on the left. People have got their faces on their chests. I wonder what we make of that. Difficult to say, really. So if you've got your resource booklets, you can do your task inside that resource booklet. If not, you can use a spare piece of paper. Step 1, give the name of the source. Step 2, what does the source show? Describe it to me. And step 3, what can we learn from the source and the author about the native peoples who live there? Okay, so a few things we can say about this is these sources were made probably about just over 100 years after Columbus landed in the New World. Let's talk about this left one first. Now, this is always a bit of a problem with artworks of this nature. Perhaps someone who had been to Guyana went to this German artist and said, well, perhaps it looked like they had slightly shorter necks than white Europeans, and perhaps this artist thought, you know what, they're going to have a short neck. I'm going to draw their face right on the top of their torso instead. Perhaps it was a caricature, a Mickey take of these native peoples. Perhaps the artist thought that these people were less sophisticated than white Europeans and therefore needed to be depicted in this way to take the Mickey out of them. On the right, you might have been, had I not given you this information underneath, you might have been forgiven for thinking that these people were violent and barbaric for doing this to these Spanish explorers. But since we've been given a bit of context, because the Spanish thirst for gold, the Indians pour liquid gold into them, we're told that actually perhaps the Spanish explorer is getting this punishment for his excessive greed for trying to take the resources of these native peoples, and perhaps they're sick of having their resources taken or their people being murdered and decide to take revenge. It doesn't justify their actions, but it does give you a reason as to why it may have happened. Okay, so we've seen a couple of sides of Christopher Columbus here. We're on the one, he's a bit of a trailblazer, discovering the New World, finds all the new cool resources, tobacco, potatoes, tomatoes, sugarcane, all of this awesome stuff that we still use today. But there is a bit of a negative side as well, and I'm sure you'll be able to feel those negative threads coming through. So this is what I got off history.com. However, his journey kicked off centuries of exploration and exploitation on the American continent. The Columbian Exchange transferred people, animals, food, and disease across cultures. You could say that Christopher Columbus laid the groundwork for, effectively, for the slave trade to take off. Without perhaps the work of Columbus, perhaps we may not have had the slave trade, and we certainly know that he and his men treated the native peoples very negatively upon their arrival. And we also heard about some of his views on the native people as well, and how he wanted to exploit them. Old World wheat became an American food staple. African coffee and Asian sugar became cash crops for Latin America, while American foods like corn, tomatoes, and potatoes were introduced to European diets. Today, Columbus has a controversial legacy. He is remembered as a daring and path-breaking explorer who transformed the New World. Yet his actions also unleashed changes that would eventually devastate the native populations he and his fellow explorers encountered. So, because of the actions of Christopher Columbus, things like sugarcane are popularized in Europe. Quite a few years later, wealthy Europeans get a bit of a taste for sugarcane, sugar, which is processed from sugarcane, which doesn't grow in Europe. So they've got to find a place to grow it, and they've got to find people to grow and harvest it as well for very little money so that they can make a profit. This, in essence, kicks off the entire triangular Atlantic slave trade because they need the cheap labor to produce it, and they need to be able to make maximum amount of money off it, and therefore not pay the workers that are farming. In essence, slavery started because of Europe's sweet tooth. So here are a few pieces of information I found of how Christopher Columbus affects us today. These are all articles that I found across the internet, and the campaigns to tear down his statues started as early as the 1990s, even before Colston, the slave trader, has his taken down in Bristol, and there's controversy about Churchill's one as well. So Christopher Columbus statue in New London taken down. Native Americans react to the removal of Christopher Columbus statue in Houston. Mayor of Columbus, a city named after Columbus, says that they will remove Columbus's statue. Remove Easton's racist Christopher Columbus statue, the petition demands. So there's a lot of controversy as to whether Christopher Columbus was someone that it is worth venerating with a statue. Is it worth honouring him? Yes, we can on one hand, accept that he did change the world in a vast number of ways, but on the other hand, accept that he is not a person that's worth founding a statue for. We reach a bit of an argument here. Is Christopher Columbus good or bad? It's difficult to fit into this kind of one side of two extremes argument. There are many shades of good or bad in between. Christopher Columbus opened up the New World, meant that the world, we knew a little bit more about it back then. However, you could very much argue that it laid the groundwork for the slave trade. His treatment of indigenous people had a lot to be desired, and the exploitation of those people and their resources as well paint him in a particularly negative light. However, I'll leave you guys to make up your decision yourself. I've been Mr. Windsor. Thank you for tuning in for my lesson. I will be joining you again in about a week's time. Thank you.